Your place is in the damn trash, not somewhere classy like this. Officer Dean Harlow growled like a hunting dog, then kicked a black woman square in the stomach in the middle of the Federal Plaza. He looked satisfied, as if he'd just flung a lump of mud back where it belonged. The crowd went silent until her gold badge hit the ground. It read, Federal Bureau of Investigation, Director Alyssa Grant. 3 minutes later, he was on his knees like a beast begging for mercy. What happens next? What kind of justice awaits him? Subscribe to the channel and comment with the state you live in so we can see just how far this story of justice reaches. Car horns blared, babies screamed without pause, blending into the familiar chaos of a shopping center at rush hour. Federal Street was loud, punctuated by the steady stomp of police boots and the clipped voices of officers on the morning shift. From a black SUV parked near the entrance, Alyssa Grant stepped out. She carried a thick file folder, eyes locked on the massive bronze doors where the words Federal Building were etched in bold against white stone. Everything seemed normal except for the sharp stares of a group of officers near the checkpoint fence. Dean Harlow, the morning shift supervisor, turned his head at the sound of approaching heels. He gave a short whistle, lifting his hand as if flagging down a violator. Restricted area. No civilians allowed, he said, voice dry and stripped of any courtesy. Alyssa stopped, opened her bag, and pulled out her credentials, speaking calmly but clearly. I have clearance. I work in this building. Harlow stepped closer, eyes scanning the badge before drifting to her deep red leather coat, his lip curling. FBI, huh? Or janitorial staff. Laughter crackled behind him from two other officers, short, cheap-toed metallic. Alyssa exhaled lightly, locking eyes with him, saying nothing more, then resumed walking. A few steps later, she paused and spoke loudly enough for all to hear. You are obstructing a federal employee in the course of her duties. Harlow let out a laugh, moved half a step forward, deliberately blocking her path, his breath thick with coffee and cigarettes. What duties exactly? Or are you here to dig up something to leak to the press? A few passers-by turned to look, drawn by curiosity. Alyssa said quietly, I won't repeat that warning, Officer Harlow. Her voice didn't rise, but every word landed hard against the cold stone. He raised an eyebrow, amused. So, you know my name, then you must also know who runs this sector. And here, my rule says anyone crossing that line without clearance gets hell. Alyssa looked around. The building loomed above, still and indifferent, as if it had witnessed 100 such standoffs. She placed the folder on a stone bench, calmly reached for her phone to call the front desk for clearance confirmation. Harlow batted her hand away, his voice nearly a hiss. I already said civilians don't get to bark orders here. A low fire rose in her chest, but Alyssa's face stayed composed. You're creating a problem for yourself. He laughed louder, the sound echoing down the street like a dare. A younger officer behind him shifted uncertainly, almost stepped forward, but Harlow gave a sideways glance that froze him in place. You think that red outfit makes you look powerful? Welcome to the real world where paper badges don't protect anyone. Alyssa said nothing. Sunlight caught her face, revealing a sharp gleam at the corner of her mouth. She picked up the file folder and turned to leave, but Harlow stepped in front of her again. Tell me, how long have you worked in this building, or did you just find an excuse to look busy? His tone dripped with sarcasm, so thick that someone nearby cleared their throat in discomfort. Alyssa stopped. Her dark eyes shimmered with metallic flecks in the sunlight, and her voice was unnervingly calm, long enough to know when someone's overstepping. The tension between them thickened the air, and for a brief moment the street noise seemed to fall away. Harlow stepped closer, the toe of his boot brushing the shadow she cast on the stone. Overstepping, he laughed, arrogant and sharp. Around here, I am the line. Alyssa held her gaze steady, not blinking her breath, even hands clutching the file like she was holding something back from breaking loose. In the distance, the clock tower above the Federal Building struck 8. Its chime rang long and low, a sound that carried like a warning. Beneath the bell, their eyes stayed locked, one used to giving orders, the other never taught to bow. The morning on Federal Street ended in that tense silence, the kind that settles before something shifts. It marked the beginning of a day when justice would be tested in a way no one saw coming. Wind swept through the row of flags outside the Federal Building, the American flag snapping hard under the fresh sunlight. Harlow's voice cut through the morning air. "This is what passes for federal work. I thought the FBI had higher standards." The words landed in the plaza like a slap, stopping a few passers-by in their tracks. A middle-aged woman clutching a paper bag froze, glanced over, then lowered her head and hurried away as if afraid his gaze might fall on her. Alyssa stood still, took a deep breath to steady herself, then picked up the file folder and continued toward the doors. She knew what she faced wasn't just one man, but a mindset embedded in the system. But Harlow wasn't finished. He moved deliberately, stepping across her path, voice tight. "I didn't give permission." Alyssa stopped. Her voice was low but firm. "You don't have the authority to stop me." He laughed a laugh soaked in arrogance, the kind that believed it could say anything without consequence. "Authority," he repeated, stepping in close. "Your authority is to shut up before I decide to see what you're hiding in that bag." The words sliced through the air, thin, sharp, and cold. The crowd stayed silent. Some turned away. Others slid phones from their pockets, hiding them beneath coats. Alyssa didn't move. Something in her calm, steady gaze made Harlow's smile falter for just a second, but he quickly masked it, raising his voice for everyone to hear. "Maybe you're confused. This isn't the place to play the victim. I've seen people try to pull the race card for some advantage. Not today." The words froze the air. A young man on a bicycle stopped at the curb, glanced over, then shook his head. A security guard inside the lobby looked out, hesitated, then backed away. Alyssa lifted her face, met his stare directly, and spoke with quiet clarity. "You just insulted a citizen while acting under color of law. Do you even realize what you're doing?" Harlow scoffed, stepping forward again, his black shoes pressing down on her shadow. "I'm doing my job, and my job is to stop unknowns from wandering around secured areas." He spoke slowly, as if each word were an order. Alyssa stepped back half a pace. Her eyes turned cold restraint, pulled tight like wire. "And my job," she said, "is to ensure no one abuses their position to demean others." Harlow raised an eyebrow, looked her over, and grinned his laugh, squeezing out between clenched teeth. "Abuse? Who do you think you are to talk to me like that? I have authority here. You have the burden of proving you're not a threat." A surge of anger moved down Alyssa's spine, but her voice stayed level, her breath long and heavy. "I've proved it by speaking to you. You've proved the opposite." That sentence landed. Some of the younger officers behind him shifted, exchanging glances, a few looking down. Harlow noticed. So he laughed louder, as if trying to remind everyone who held control. "Listen, you should be grateful I haven't booked you for interfering with a federal operation. People like you who don't know their place need to be taught how to act." He turned his head toward another officer. "You see this trash, like her, always thinks they're special." Alyssa looked around and saw the eyes of the onlookers flicker between pity and fear. She turned back to face him again, her voice low but firm. "I don't need to be special. I need you to follow the law." Harlow squinted his shoulders, tensing slightly. "The law? I've seen plenty of people use the law to cover guilt. Looks like you learned that quick." His voice dripped with sarcasm, but this time Alyssa didn't respond. She just stared at him, her eyes calm to the point of being unsettling. Harlow noticed the silence, and it shook him. He stepped closer, close enough that his breath hit her face. "I'll ask one last time, what are you doing here?" Alyssa answered slowly, each word clear. "Working in this federal building." A brief silence passed, then Harlow laughed left a harsh cracking sound. "You think I'm buying that? You look like someone snooping around for an excuse." He turned to his colleague, speaking loud enough for others to hear. "Search her bag." No one moved. A young officer pressed his lips together and said quietly, "Officer, if she is cleared, we'll be breaking the law." Harlow snapped back around, eyes blazing. "What did you just say?" No one answered. Only the wind picked up scattering papers near their feet. Alyssa tilted her head slightly and spoke just loud enough for him to hear. "The more you push, the more you show me what you're afraid of." Harlow froze for half a second, then spoke in a low, sharp voice. "Afraid I've never feared anyone, especially fakes hiding behind justice." A distant car horn echoed, breaking the heavy silence. Alyssa gathered her folder eyes locked on him. Their standoff wasn't over, but everyone could feel something shifting. The silence in the crowd was no longer indifference. It was anticipation. Something was coming, and Federal Street felt colder than before, as if warning that every line was about to be crossed. Tension hung in the air like a wire ready to snap. Alyssa tried to keep her pace, stepping aside to avoid escalation, but Dean Harlow suddenly raised his leg, the kick sharp and unexpected. She lost her balance and hit the cold stone ground hard. The impact echoed off the Federal Building's stone walls, freezing everyone in place. A gasp burst from the crowd. A young woman pulled out her phone with trembling hands, barely hitting record before another officer barked, voice full of threat, "No recording." The woman flinched, stepped back, nearly dropping her phone, but kept it pointed toward them. Alyssa lay on her side, hair streaked with dust, breath, heavy palms pressed to the freezing stone. A drop of blood from her lip at the steps, bright red, silent. She pushed up on one hand and looked at the man standing over her, his eyes full of satisfaction like someone who had just proven his power. The crowd stirred, a few whispers mixing with uneasy glances. An older man stopped, shook his head slightly, while a younger man hissed through his teeth, "He just kicked her." But no one stepped forward. Harlow stood still, breath laced with smoke, voice low with a dry laugh. "You get the rules now. Around here, every order comes from me." Alyssa wiped the blood from her mouth. Her voice came firm, steady. "You just violated civil rights and federal law." A simple sentence, but it rang through the air like a formal charge. Harlow bent down, his face close to hers, twisted smile in place. "My law," he said slowly, "is the baton on my belt. Got it?" Alyssa met his eyes. Her gaze wasn't scared, it was remembering. Something in that look made him hesitate for a beat, like seeing a harder, colder reflection of himself. He stepped back slightly, gave a dismissive laugh. "You should be grateful I'm not arresting you right now for obstruction." Alyssa rose on her hands, voice slow but clear. "You just kicked an unarmed citizen in public. Don't think you can rewrite the law with your voice." A young officer stepped forward, face tight. "Officer, that's enough. There are a lot of people here." Harlow shot him a glance sharp enough to silence him on the spot. "Anyone recording that, I'll confiscate your phone," he shouted, his voice cracking like a whip, but a few had already captured it. The soft buzz of recording phones hummed from jacket pocket. Alyssa picked up the scattered folder papers spread across the ground. She gathered them one by one, eyes still locked on him. "You think justice is something you can stomp into the ground?" Harlow lowered his voice, trying to appear composed, but something flickered in his eyes, uncertainty. "Justice is what I'm trained to uphold, not something people like you get to redefine." A woman nearby spoke quietly. "She has the right to speak. Why treat her like a criminal?" The words made Harlow turn his head, his voice dropping low with threat. "Who just said that silence followed?" Only the wind moving through the flags and the crunch of shoes on gravel remained. Alyssa shifted her shoulder and stood tall, even as pain radiated from her side. She stared straight at him, the morning light flashing in her eyes, and for a second, Harlow faltered. "You made your choice to show force, Dean Harlow," she said, her voice low but sharp as steel. "Force doesn't protect you from consequences." He curled his lip and muttered, "Is that a threat?" "It's a reminder." she replied calmly. The silence stretched then. Harlow laughed rough and cracked, hiding a slight tremble. "I've got an entire team here. What do you have besides that, mouth?" As the words left him, a glint of sunlight hit the small badge inside the folder Alyssa held. Gold flashed, then vanished. Harlow didn't notice, but a few in the crowd did. A man whispered, "I think she really is Federal." Harlow caught the murmur, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" he asked, voice quieter, edged with suspicion. Alyssa answered softly, her gaze unwavering. "Someone here to remind you that power doesn't grant you the freedom to degrade others." Silence settled over them. On the stone beneath their feet, a small streak of blood remained, the sunlight catching it, turning it bright like proof of a mistake that couldn't be undone. And at the edge of the plaza, a few cameras still pointed in their direction, quietly capturing the moment justice began to find its voice. The sound of sirens faded, leaving only the wind passing through the flags in front of the Federal building, hissing softly like a warning. The crowd stepped back, forming a wide circle, their eyes shifting between outrage and fear. A woman holding a small child whispered to someone beside her, "Why are they doing this to her?" But her voice faded, nearly swallowed by the steady rhythm of police boots on stone. Near the fence, a young rookie officer stood frozen. Sweat slid down his temple, his hand trembling as he clutched his cap. His gaze darted between Alyssa and Dean Harlow, caught between the clear line of right and wrong and the fear of power. He opened his mouth to speak, but Harlow turned his stare cold enough to shatter whatever courage remained. Alyssa stayed at the center of the steps where the blood had dried into a dark mark. She stood tall, wiped the last trace of blood from her lip, then looked up at the man standing before the crowd like he held the law in his hand. Her voice rang out calm but firm, each word sharp. "You made your choice. Now you'll learn to face the consequences." No one replied. The entire street seemed to hold its breath. Harlow let out a mocking laugh, dry and hollow, blending with the metallic clink of guns on the belts around him. "Who do you think you are to teach me anything?" he said, voice low and filled with contempt. Alyssa looked at him for a long moment, her gaze cutting through the mask of authority he clung to. "I'm not here to teach you," she said quietly. "I'm here to remind you what you forgot and what you still need to learn." Harlow frowned, his face flushing red. The crowd watched. Sunlight stretched shadows across the stone. A middle-aged man spoke softly. "She's right, he's gone too far." But the person next to him tugged his arm, whispering, "Be quiet. They're watching." Fear spread like smoke, holding people back even when they knew justice was slipping. Harlow stepped forward, his shoe landing on a paper that had fallen from Alyssa's folder. The sound was faint, but sharp enough for all to hear. "You're good with words," he said, then leaned in and slapped her across the face, his voice low like a whisper. "But words mean nothing when I'm the one holding the gun." Alyssa didn't step back. Her eyes held no fear, only calculation weighing his limits. She replied slowly, "Holding a gun doesn't make you stronger. It only makes you forget you were once human." The words made Harlow freeze for half a second, then he let out a loud laugh, but it no longer sounded steady. A gust of wind swept through, lifting the scattered pages from her folder. White sheets marked with red seals spun through the air under the sun, falling like snow. The crowd watched in silence, the only sound the soft rustle of paper touching stone. In that moment, everyone understood their silence was turning into complicity. Alyssa looked at the papers, then at Harlow. "You can step on the law," she said, her voice dropping low, "but don't forget someone is watching." Harlow glanced around and spotted several phone cameras aimed his way. He shouted, "Put those down. Anyone filming me will end up like her." But no one moved. The silence now was no longer fear, it was resistance. The young rookie still stood in place, gripping his cap, his eyes shifting from Harlow to Alyssa, realizing that staying quiet made him no different from the man beside him. A drop of sweat slid down his cheek. This time he took a deep breath and spoke, his voice trembling. "Officer, stop! There are people here." Harlow spun around, eyes blazing. "What did you say?" The rookie didn't repeat it, but his silence said enough. Alyssa remained standing, the light catching her hair, making her dark eyes turn sharp. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "Everyone heard you, Dean Harlow, and they will also see you pay for it." He forced a smile, trying to hold his composure, but his hand twitched slightly at his belt. "You're too confident. I could arrest you right now for obstructing an officer." Her reply came instantly, voice calm and cold. "Luckily, I'm someone with the authority to protect the justice you're trying to destroy." The words made Harlow hesitate for a breath, but he kept smiling, thin and bitter. Justice. That's a funny word. You probably read it in a book. A few in the crowd murmured as Alyssa stepped forward. Now, only one step stood between them. She didn't blink. Her stare was so steady it made Harlow look away for a split second. "No," she said quietly. "I learned justice from men like you." Silence stretched out. The sun was high now, casting its shadows long across the stone steps, one straight, one tilted. At the edge of the crowd, someone whispered, "They got it on camera. All of it." And another voice replied, "He's done." Harlow heard it but couldn't react. He felt something slip in the power he thought untouchable. Alyssa only tilted her head, slightly, eyes turning toward the Federal building behind her as if it had been watching and waiting for justice to step out of silence. In the blinding sun, wind swept across the steps, carrying the last trace of her blood. No one said a word, but their eyes had changed. Fear was turning into awareness, and in that moment, Federal Street was no longer a place of power. It was the place where power began to be redefined. Silence covered the plaza, heavy like a curtain about to catch fire. Alyssa stepped forward, her gaze cold and deep enough to make Harlow flinch. Her voice rang out sharp as steel. "Name, rank, unit." Harlow laughed, but the sound was dry, no longer carrying weight. "Officer Dean Harlow, Central Division." "Now shut your mouth, will you?" As the last word left him, he raised his hand to push her back, a show of power. But before he made contact, Alyssa grabbed his wrist, swift and precise. A short hiss followed as she turned, lowered her stance, and flipped him cleanly. His large frame slammed against the stone, the impact echoing across the plaza, sending the crowd stepping back on instinct. His gun flew from his belt, skidding across the smooth stone and stopping at the feet of a young officer. It all happened too fast for anyone around to grasp what they'd seen. Alyssa stayed grounded, breathing steady, eyes locked on Harlow as he scrambled on the ground. The wind picked up, lifting pages from her folder, swirling them around like silent witnesses. Harlow pushed up on his hands, face pale with shame and rage, about to speak, when a gasp came from the crowd. A gold badge slipped from Alyssa's collar, landing on the stone and catching the sunlight, bright and undeniable. A few seconds passed in stillness before whispers swept through like wind. "FBI chief. She's the FBI chief." Someone spoke softly, but the words spread fast, jumping from one mouth to another like fire on dry grass. Harlow heard every word. His face locked up, eyes wide, jaw twitching. He stared at the badge, then at the woman who had taken him down with a single move. His whole body tightened as if refusing to believe what had just happened. Alyssa bent down, picked up the badge, and wiped the faint dust from its surface, slow and composed. She clipped it back to her collar and looked at him. Her voice no longer sounded like a warning, it was a command. "Stand up." Harlow crawled to his knees, hands shaken, unable to meet her eyes. "I'm asking you," she continued, voice steady. "Do you know what you just did?" He stammered, choking on his word. I didn't know who you were." Alyssa cut him off, her gaze direct. "And if I were no one at all, would you still have the right to kick me?" The crowd's focus narrowed in. A middle-aged man started clapping a single clap that soon spread. Harlow spun around, shouting, "Shut up," but no one listened. The more he yelled, the smaller he became in the open light. Alyssa stayed still, every move of hers carrying the weight of real authority without needing to raise her voice or prove anything. She spoke one line, quiet but sharp enough to settle the air. "Justice doesn't need to be loud. It only needs to show up." Another officer rushed over, his face paling as he realized who the woman in front of him was. He lowered his head and spoke softly. "Chief Grant, I didn't know you were here." Alyssa turned to him, her voice steady. "And that's exactly the problem. When he kicked me, he didn't care who I was. He only saw a black woman." Her words dropped like a stone into still water, sending quiet ripples through the eyes of everyone around. Harlow lifted his head, lips trembling as he tried to explain, but no excuse sounded right anymore. I was just doing my job." Alyssa stared at him, her voice sharp as a blade. "Whose job? The law's or your own bias?" He had no answer. Sweat gathered on his forehead, and his breathing grew heavy, burdened by shame. A black SUV pulled up at the end of the street, and two federal agents stepped out, scanning the scene before approaching. One of them called out, "Chief Grant, are you all right?" The sound of that name made Harlow's face go pale. He looked around and saw every eye on him, his sense of power collapsing like a thin wall in the wind. Alyssa nodded at the agents, then said quietly, "I'm fine. But someone else is about to be less so." She walked up to Harlow, leaned in, and spoke low enough for only him to hear. 3 minutes ago, who did you think I was?" He didn't answer. His lips stayed shut, his eyes dull. Alyssa stood up straight and turned to the crowd, her voice clear, calm, and firm. "Everyone makes mistakes, but when power is used as an excuse to humiliate, it stops being a mistake. It becomes a crime." People around her nodded. Some raised their phones to record, and this time no one stopped them. Harlow looked down, his fists clenched but unmoving. Sunlight hit his face, lighting up the dust, and sweat across his brow, the image of a man who had just realized his limits. Alyssa stepped back, gave him one last look. "You will be investigated, Dean Harlow, and I promise you'll be held to the same justice as every citizen you ever disrespected." She turned away, leaving him standing in the middle of the silent circle. On the stone ground, her shadow stretched long, bright, and straight, while his lay broken in the sun. The morning on Federal Street ended in the wind, but in that stillness everyone knew justice had just begun to take shape. The sound of tires screeching echoed across the plaza. A second black SUV sped in from the end of the street, its door flung open as two federal agents in bulletproof vests stepped out with sharp reflexes, eyes scanning, hands resting on their holstered guns. The entire area froze in that instant. People stood still, phones mid-record held motionless. One of the agents stepped forward, voice firm. "Chief Grant, are you all right?" Alyssa turned, her voice calm and commanding. "I am." "He's not." The words hit the stone like iron dropped in water, heavy, deep, drawing every gaze toward Dean Harlow. Harlow sat slumped on the pavement, breath, ragged shirt, wrinkled hands planted on the ground like he still couldn't believe what was happening. His face looked blank, eyes wide, pupils tight, sweat running down both temples. The feeling of power draining from his body left him hollow, like waking from a nightmare he had created himself. He tried to smile, but it twisted. No trace of confidence or control left. "Chief Grant?" He stammered, his voice tight, like it was being choked. You're really the FBI, Chief?" Alyssa looked down at him, her gaze steady, the golden badge on her chest catching the light like a blade, cutting through every excuse. Surprised Officer Harlow. 3 minutes ago, who did you think I was?" Silence blanketed the plaza. Only the wind moved the security banners, and the steady beat of agent boots tapped across the stone. A few bystanders near the front raised hands to their mouths, eyes caught between shock and satisfaction. Alyssa's question hung in the air like a verdict, no gavel needed, no sentence read aloud. Federal Street had become the courtroom, and the man who once held power now sat beneath the sun, head bowed. Harlow opened his mouth, but no words came. He looked down at his shaking hands covered in dust and sweat. The world, he thought, belonged to him, had collapsed in 3 minutes, just enough time for a mistake to become fate. One of the agents stepped closer, voice formal. "Officer Harlow, by order of the FBI, you are being detained for investigation of assaulting a federal employee and obstructing official duty." Harlow jerked slightly, turned to him, voice thin. "Wait, I didn't know who she was," the agent cut in. "And if she were no one, you would still kick a woman in public." The question hit hard. Harlow's throat tightened, mouth dry. He looked around for support in the eyes of his fellow officers, found only lowered heads. Some near him avoided his gaze. Others silently pulled out their phones and began recording. Alyssa stood tall, her hair swept back by the wind. Sunlight cast in sharp lines across her face. She showed no victory, no anger. This moment needed no added emotion. Everything was already clear. She looked around, her voice steady. "I want the entire area secured. The report will be submitted directly to federal headquarters. Witnesses will be invited to give statements." The agents nodded quickly, setting up perimeter tape around the scene. The crowd began to murmur. "She really is the FBI chief. He's done. I got the whole thing." A woman nearby spoke, her voice shaky. "I don't know who she is, but when she stood up, I saw what justice really looks like." Harlow heard it all, but the world around him felt muffled, like it was sealed behind glass. Sounds warped, distant. He looked up and met Alyssa's eyes. In them there was no hatred, only a cold clarity. She spoke softly, almost a whisper. "You thought that kick was power, but it only showed you forgot who you served." The words made him lower his head, shoulders slumping. The agents stepped in, locked cuffs around Harlow's wrists. The metal clinked loudly, echoing through the sunlight. As they led him away, Alyssa stayed still, watching without a word. Her face, calm eyes fixed on the badge catching the light on her chest, the symbol of a duty heavier than any authority. On the steps where she had fallen, the blood had dried. A young rookie quietly walked over, picked up a page carried off by the wind, and handed it to her. Alyssa took it, nodded, and said softly, "Thank you." He looked at her, a mix of respect and shame in his eyes, then turned away, avoiding the gaze of Harlow being led off. In the distance, the crowd remained. Someone began clapping, slow alone at first, then others joined, spreading like ripples. It wasn't applause for a victory. It was a recognition that justice, even late, could still be believed in. Alyssa looked up toward the row of flags waving above. 3 minutes, just 3 minutes, were enough for one officer to show his true nature, enough for a city to face what it had long chosen to ignore. She took a deep breath, gripped the folder tight in her hands, her eyes fixed on the federal building ahead. 3 minutes, she repeated in her mind, and this whole system will have to answer for it. The plaza fell quiet, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the stillness of a moment where justice had finally been seen. That afternoon, sunlight still poured over the stone steps where the morning's events unfolded. Federal Plaza was nearly empty, marked only by chalk lines and dusty scraps of paper left fluttering in the wind. But online, the story was burning hotter than ever. A young law student from Jefferson Law School who had stood behind a pillar during the incident quietly uploaded his video with the simple caption, "He kicked the FBI chief." Just 6 words, no explanation, no context, but they exploded across social media like a spark to gasoline. Within hours, thousands of shares appeared, each one more outraged than the last. 6 hours later, the video had reached 4 million views. The comment section was flooded with rage, empathy, and bitter truth. "If she weren't FBI, she'd be dead," one person wrote with thousands of likes beneath it. "This is why people don't trust the system anymore. Justice shouldn't depend on a badge." He kicked a woman and thought he could walk away. The story had moved beyond Jefferson. It was now national. Local news stations broke the story, and within hours, major networks followed. NBC aired the clip in a tight loop, Officer Dean Harlow kicking a black woman on the steps. Then, seconds later, she rose, flipped him, and the gold badge flashed in the sun. The anchor repeated the question millions were now asking. What if she wasn't the FBI chief? At the same time, CNN's headline read, "Systemic Racism Caught on Camera, the Jefferson Incident." Hashtag Justice for Alyssa hit #1 on Twitter within 8 hours. Under the hashtag were posts, photos, comments, and calls for action. Students, lawyers, former agents, human rights groups, everyone joined in demanding answers from the Central Police Department. Inside a small media operations room at police headquarters, an emergency meeting was underway. Harlow had been isolated, but no one knew his exact location. The district police chief, a gray-haired man seated at the center of the tense room, spoke heavily. "We need to release a statement." A young communications officer looked down at his phone and said quietly, "It's blowing up. The whole country knows." Finally, a statement was issued. The Central Police Department is conducting an internal investigation into the incident involving Officer Dean Harlow and FBI Chief Alyssa Grant. Every word was chosen carefully, trying to sound neutral, but no one was convinced. Online, the reaction was immediate. Internal investigation. That's their favorite trick. Translation, they're buying time. We've seen this before. No justice until they're forced to act. Under each comment, thousands of shares and angry reactions piled up. Media analysts noted that the public no longer trusted the phrase "under investigation." It had become a symbol of delay of a system protecting itself. And this time, people weren't staying silent. That night, hundreds of Jefferson residents gathered outside the police headquarters. They carried signs that read, "Accountability now." She stood for all of us. You kicked justice. Now, face it. From the buildings around the square, light from thousands of phones lit up the night, forming a sea of white. A female student stood in the crowd holding a megaphone, her voice shaking but clear. "If she didn't have that gold badge, we'd be talking about a deadly assault. We can't let silence kill justice again." That line was recorded, shared, and became one of the most quoted messages of the night. Alyssa didn't appear in public right away. She remained at the federal office while agents completed the official report. When her young assistant placed a phone in front of her, the screen flooded with news. She glanced at it briefly. Her face showed no satisfaction, no anger. "We don't need to answer with words," she said softly. "The truth will speak for us." The assistant nodded in silence, but deep down understood this was no longer just a case. It had become a symbol. The night in Jefferson glowed with light. Signs fluttered in the wind, voices rose alongside distant sirens. In a shadowed corner, a TV reporter spoke into the camera. A video under 1 minute long has shaken the system. But what's behind it isn't just a kick. It's the question of how we treat people before we know who they are. In a small apartment in Chicago, a 12-year-old girl watched the video on her phone, eyes wide. She turned to her mother and asked softly, "Mom, who is she?" The mother replied, her voice low, "Someone you should remember." And somewhere in that dim room, the glow of the screen lit the girl's face, a new belief quietly planted. Back in Jefferson, where it all began, the steps had been cleaned, but their mark couldn't be erased. The wind carried chants from outside mixed with the sound of change drawn near. That video, simple and brutal, did what the system hadn't done in years. It gave justice a face, a name, and this time, a voice. 2 days after the video went viral, Jefferson was no longer quiet. Reporters camped outside Central Police Headquarters, cameras flashing nonstop, the front gate packed with media crews. Inside the building, a tense silence spread. On the 3rd floor, in a small HR office, a tech staffer sat frozen in front of his screen, hands trembling as he read through a chain of emails sent to the anonymous inbox. The subject line was clear, directive from command. Do not cooperate with FBI inquiry. He read it again in disbelief. Below was a series of internal messages, one from a senior officer under Harlow's command. Stay silent, do not respond to FBI requests, and do not release documents to anyone without my approval. One line made the technician's blood run cold. Don't let them dig or everything falls apart. Hours later, the email leaked. News outlets confirmed its authenticity, and by late afternoon it was front page across multiple platforms. The phrase, "do not cooperate with the FBI," became a symbol of cover-up. The Central Police Department quickly denied it, claiming the email was doctored, but the evidence spread too fast. Under every post, thousands of angry comments piled up. Many called it the system's rebellion against justice. Amid the chaos, a message appeared in Alyssa's inbox. The sender was Blue Shield, an anonymous, untraceable address. The note was short, but hit hard. Harlow beat a black boy last year. It got buried. I have proof. Attached was a deleted report wiped from the official system documenting a 15-year-old boy seriously injured in a clash with Central Police. Records showed Harlow was directly involved, but the report concluded use of force justified. The case was closed in 2 days, never reviewed independently. Alyssa read every line, her face growing more somber. She leaned back, eyes fixed on the evening light spreading across her desk. In that moment, she understood she wasn't just facing one rogue officer. She was facing the structure built to protect him. "How long have they been burying things like this?" she asked quietly, more to herself than anyone. Her assistant stood beside her in silence, nodding when she said, "Get the federal investigative team ready. We're not waiting for documents. We'll find them ourselves." She issued the order through secure channels, activating the FBI's internal response team in Washington. Everyone on the team understood this was no routine inquiry. It was a power struggle, one built on badges, the other on truth. Within 24 hours, they obtained the full Central PD staff list, extracted hidden complaint records, and uncovered at least 7 incidents of violence tied to Harlow's unit that had never been made public. In a closed-door meeting at the federal office under dim lights, Alyssa looked around at the team of investigators. Their faces showed a mix of anger and determination. She spoke slowly, her voice low. "This is no longer about one incident. We are looking at a hole in the entire system. A police officer only dares to kick a citizen when he knows someone will cover for him. Our job is to pull that cover down." No one spoke. Only the scratch of pens on paper filled the room. After the meeting ended, Alyssa stayed behind. She looked up at the city map on the wall, red dots marking areas where abuse complaints had been filed. Jefferson sat in the center, but the dots spread outward like a web, not one place, but across the state. She wondered how many people stayed silent because they didn't have a badge, how many were erased from records for lack of evidence. The office light reflected off her face, glinting off the gold badge on her chest, a symbol many saw as a shield, but to her, it was a reminder every power comes with the burden to examine itself. Across the city, a young female officer, the one who sent the anonymous email, sat alone in her small apartment, blue light from the laptop casting shadows on her tense face. She stared at the message she had sent, then locked her phone and exhaled. She knew what she had done might end her career, but the silence of the institution had already cost her more. Outside, the sound of police sirens rose, but to her it no longer meant safety. It was a reminder of what had been distorted. News of the leaked email and the federal investigation stirred public outrage. Experts filled TV screens. Former police officers spoke of the system's chronic illness, where internal discipline was used as a tool to bury the truth. Alyssa's story, once a case of individual violence, had become an indictment of the entire structure of power and law enforcement. That night, as the city lit up, Alyssa left the office late. She stepped onto the balcony, the night wind carrying the noise of Jefferson below. She looked down and saw people still gathered holding signs that read, "Justice for Alyssa," phone lights glowing like tiny stars. She knew this fight wouldn't end soon, but at least the truth had stepped out of the dark. From that moment on, Alyssa Grant was no longer just a name from the incident on Federal Street. She had become a symbol of a fight everyone knew existed, but for far too long no one dared to name. 3 days after the federal investigation was launched, Jefferson erupted. Media outlets published documents Alyssa's team had uncovered, exposing a wave of similar incidents. Each article revealed how violent actions were justified with a few vague lines in police reports. One news channel aired footage of a man whose arm was broken during a traffic stop, his record labeled "resisting arrest." A grieving mother spoke through tears about losing her son in a shooting, saying she had filed complaints for a year before the file vanished. Each story, each piece of evidence hit like a wave crashing into the wall of silence the Central Police Department had built. Major newspapers printed bold headlines, "Jefferson's hidden files, the system that protected violence." These words lit up screens across the city from City Hall to train stations. The media dropped its neutral tone, asking directly, "How many more Harlows are being protected?" Journalists reopened cases once closed mid-investigation, and dozens of names surfaced. The more truth emerged, the wider public anger spread. From Jefferson cities across the state began to organize marches in support of Alyssa and the investigation team. By Saturday night, the plaza outside police headquarters was packed. Thousands of citizens stood shoulder to shoulder holding signs with bold letters, "No more cover-ups." The atmosphere was both angry and powerful. Drums pounded, chants rose in unison. Justice means transparency. In the crowd were past victims, bystanders who had watched the video, and others drawn by the cause, but they all shared one feeling: they were witnessing a turning point. Light from hundreds of phones lit the sky, glowing across faces filled with resolve. Inside the building, Central's police chief stood by the window. He remained silent, eyes heavy, as an officer placed a new report on his desk. "Sir, the marches have spread to neighboring cities. People are demanding that the investigation results be made public." The older man nodded, but said nothing. He knew this wave would not stop in Jefferson, and it was strong enough to tear down any illusion that the system still worked as claimed. Meanwhile, Alyssa continued her work inside the federal office, monitoring every development on screen. She felt no satisfaction, no celebration, because she understood public opinion could shift in a day, but reforming a system would take a generation. Still, when she saw the crowd outside, she knew something had changed. Fear had been replaced by demand. People were no longer waiting for someone else to speak for them. She signed the next order to release all internal reports from Central Police within 72 hours. That decision, once made official, would force many to finally face the truth. In front of the building, the crowd kept chanting, their voices rising with the night wind echoing against walls that once stood as symbols of power. A young reporter pointed the camera and spoke live. Jefferson was once known as a city of silence, but tonight, silence has been awakened. The words aired across national television, drawing eyes from every corner of the country. Inside, officers no longer dared to step out, and on the top floor, some quietly packed up files, knowing the time for cover-ups had ended. As the night wore on, chants of "no more cover-ups" continued to ring between buildings, blending with sirens and the flashing lights of media trucks. Alyssa watched through the window, thinking that sometimes justice doesn't have to come from above. It can rise from justified outrage. Jefferson had begun to speak, and this time the nation was listening. The next morning, with public anger flooding social media and news cycles, Central's police chief was forced to appear before the press. He stepped up to the podium, face stiff, hands clasped, voice straining to stay calm. Dozens of cameras and reporters crowded behind the flashing lights like hundreds of eyes, pressing him to speak the truth. He opened with the usual line. The Central Police Department shares the public's concern and assures that the matter is being reviewed carefully. Then he paused, glanced at the paper in his hand, and continued in a shaky tone. What was seen in the video does not reflect the full operational context. This was a misunderstanding during the execution of duty. The moment the words landed, the room exploded in noise. A reporter stood up and asked, "You're calling the act of kicking a citizen a misunderstanding, and when that citizen is the FBI director, it's still a technical error?" The chief stayed silent, sweat beading on his forehead, forcing a rigid smile. "We believe everything will be clarified when the investigation concludes," he said, voice trembling as if reciting a script memorized under pressure. The press conference was replayed immediately across national news, paired with thousands of furious public reactions. The phrase "operational misunderstanding" became a national joke across platforms. Hashtags like #misunderstanding, can to kick justice, and #no more excuses spread fast, capturing the bitter sarcasm aimed at a system still trying to shield itself. Evening talk shows devoted entire segments to dissecting his remarks. One legal analyst said on air, "The phrase operational misunderstanding appears nowhere in law. It's just a polite term for evasion." A few hours later, Alyssa appeared on national television during a CBS special. She sat in front of the camera, face clear under the lights, voice calm but heavy with the weight of someone who has faced pain. The host asked Chief Grant, "How do you respond to the statement, 'This was an operational misunderstanding'?" Alyssa looked straight into the lens, her eyes steady, each word falling like a cut. "Misunderstandings don't make people bleed." The studio went silent for a few seconds, then the host looked down at a loss for words. Alyssa continued, "If we call violence a misunderstanding, we legitimize cruelty, and true justice is never built on excuses." That image replayed all night. Social media erupted, the clip of her words spreading at lightning speed. People shared it with the caption, "She said what we've all been thinking." Within hours, from Jefferson to New York, signs reading "Misunderstanding doesn't bleed" appeared at rallies. Her words became a symbol not because they were loud, but because the truth in them was undeniable. For too long, people had forgotten that justice isn't protected by language, but by the courage to face what went wrong. Jefferson lit up that night, but no one mistook illusion for truth anymore. 1 week after the national uproar, the Federal Committee building in Washington became the center of attention. Outside the gates, dozens of TV cameras lined up as reporters crowded in, and every headline flashed the same topic: Officer Dean Harlow's hearing. Inside, the room was thick with tension, white lights casting down on the long row of committee members facing the man who had forced an entire system to be re-examined. Dean Harlow entered his uniform more polished than ever, but his steps heavy. His face was pale, his eyes unfocused, yet he tried to appear composed. When the chair asked him to speak, he raised his head, voice trembling but restrained. "I acknowledge a procedural mistake, but I had no intent to cause harm. Everything happened under pressure, and I misidentified the situation." His words echoed clearly, broadcast live to millions nationwide. A silver-haired congresswoman stared at him, her tone sharp. "You say misidentified, but the video shows the victim identified herself 3 times, even stated her workplace. So what exactly did you confuse?" Harlow said nothing, his hands clasped, nails pressing into his palms. I reacted instinctively," he stammered. "In high-pressure scenarios, we sometimes don't have time to analyze." The congresswoman leaned in, replied crisply, "You kicked someone holding a file. That's not a reaction, that's a choice. Silence followed, broken only by pens scratching paper and Harlow's strained breathing. Alyssa sat behind in the witness section. She wore a black suit, her gaze steady. When called to testify, she rose and walked slowly to the table, her face unreadable. The moderator asked Chief Grant, "Do you have a response to Officer Harlow's testimony?" Alyssa looked at him, her voice low but firm. "I believe mistakes happen when people see others but fail to see the humanity in them. This wasn't a mistake. It was a deliberate choice by someone who believed he had the right to humiliate another." Harlow lowered his head, fingers gripping the table edge. Reporters scribbled quickly, flashes popped. Another committee member asked, "You mentioned pressure. Was it from the woman you kicked or from the bias you carried in with you?" Harlow opened his mouth but said nothing. Sweat rolled down his neck, his throat locked, and all he could repeat was, I didn't mean to. Alyssa no longer looked at him. Her eyes turned to the public gallery, to the faces of others hurt by the same system he had represented. She spoke slowly, each word like stone. "When a man uses violence to prove power, he's not protecting justice. He's weakening it." The hearing ended in heavy silence. As Harlow was escorted out the hallway, crowd stayed completely still, with only the shutter clicks of cameras echoing. Alyssa remained for a moment staring at the empty chairs, feeling no relief. She knew the issue wasn't one man, but a culture that had allowed him to believe he could act that way. Outside, wind swept through the white stone columns, and Jefferson, though hundreds of miles away, seemed to echo the sound of that morning, the sound of a woman standing up and of a false certainty collapsing. Alyssa stood still for a moment before speaking. The room was silent, lit only by the soft glare of dozens of camera lenses on her face. Her voice rang clear, not loud, but every word cut through the space between her and the man slumped in front of her. "You saw me," she said. "He's locked on Harlow. You knew who I was, and you still chose to act that way." A ripple ran through the room, audience members leaning forward as if afraid to miss a breath. That line wasn't just for him. It was for everyone who had ever used mistake as an excuse for cruelty. Harlow looked up, then back down, a flicker of panic in his eyes. Sweat beaded on his forehead, ran down his collar, shoulders trembled. For the first time, the cameras caught his gaze, the look of someone who had lost all power. The committee moderator stayed silent, sensing no question needed adding. Alyssa continued, her voice steady, every word a quiet indictment. "You can talk about pressure, about mistakes, but before you kicked me, you looked me in the eye. You didn't act in darkness. You knew exactly what you were doing, and you wanted others to see it, because to you, power meant proving who you could make kneel." The room went still, so quiet that the scratch of a reporter's pen stopping mid-word could be heard. Harlow didn't move. His hands clenched, knuckles, white throat tight. One committee member glanced at another, then lowered their head to take notes. No one dared to interrupt her. Alyssa took a deep breath, as if gathering everything she'd carried until now. "You thought you were punishing a woman," she said, "but really, you were exposing your own fear. You feared seeing someone of another skin color stand as your equal. You feared losing a place society gave you, but you never earned. And that fear made you violent." A short sentence, but the room thickened as if time itself had tensed. The camera panned slowly, framing Harlow's face. His eyes were sunken, breathing fast, lips tightly pressed. Every light, every lens pointed at him, and what remained in his eyes was fear. Not of punishment, but of being truly seen. A few seconds later, the chair nodded, signaling the clerk to stop recording. The entire chamber remained still. No one clapped, no one moved. They all understood this hearing didn't need drama because justice had just spoken in its quietest moment. Alyssa stepped back, her eyes still on Harlow. She said nothing more, knowing any words now would be unnecessary. As she stepped down from the stand, her footsteps echoed, measured, heavy. Harlow remained seated, head bowed, the light casting his shadow long across the floor, distorted and small. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every frame, not cutting a single second, because this was the image of a man who once symbolized authority, now forced by justice to face himself. Out in the hallway, the murmurs began, clusters of reporters rushing out to file breaking news. But in that room, Alyssa paused at the door, looking around, her gaze calm but unshaken. She knew what had just happened wasn't her victory. It was the beginning of a real conversation about justice. Harlow didn't look up. He kept his head low, the cold studio lights still clinging to his face, preserving the final image of a man who had lost what he once believed was power, but had only ever been fear dressed in uniform. Immediately after the hearing, the Department of Justice officially announced the launch of the largest federal investigation in 2 decades into police misconduct in Jefferson and surrounding cities. On national television, the DOJ spokesperson read the statement before dozens of reporters. "We will work with the Federal Bureau of Investigation to form a special task force to investigate acts of concealment, evidence destruction, and internal cover-ups within local police departments." The statement drew applause in the room, and outside people in Jefferson cried, believing the truth was finally being given a chance to speak. The task force included 32 federal agents led by a senior investigative director reporting directly to Alyssa Grant. They operated independently without influence from local law enforcement, and their first mission was to seize all internal data from the Central Police Department. The next morning, FBI vehicles arrived in front of Central Headquarters, red and blue lights flashing across the building's glass. Crowds lined the sidewalks, cheering as boxes of documents were carried out. Inside, the tech team bypassed the internal data system security layers, uncovering thousands of files marked permanently deleted. When the first images appeared, the investigation room fell silent. Dozens of videos revealed past acts of violence that had been overwritten, edited, or buried in folders accessible only to command staff. One agent whispered, "They erased what made people lose faith." Alyssa stood behind them, her face unreadable, but her hand clenched tight. She knew each frame was a piece of truth the system had buried beneath a word called procedure. The videos revealed familiar faces, officers named in internal reports the public never saw. A man choked onto the street, a teenager pepper sprayed while begging to breathe, a woman shoved to the ground for asking why her car was being searched. Each image answered a question society had asked for years. Why is justice silent? A young agent lowered his tablet, voice tight. Without Chief Grant's video, all of this would have stayed in the dark. Alyssa replied, her voice low but firm. Light doesn't ask for permission to shine. It just needs to be turned on. At the same time, the DOJ issued emergency subpoenas for 12 police commanders tied to the data deletion. Raids happened simultaneously in 3 cities, collecting hard drives, memory cards, and paper records. The news spread fast, with the whole nation watching by the minute. On cable news, an anchor stated, "This is no longer just about Jefferson. This is an investigation touching the core of America's trust in justice." That evening, Alyssa stepped out of the meeting room, looking at the crowd gathered in front of the federal building. The light from their phones lit up the sky, reflected in her eyes like countless reminders. She understood that from this moment on, the truth could not go back to where it was. Dozens of deleted videos had been recovered, hundreds of names would be spoken again, and every new piece of evidence was a fragment forcing the system to confront itself. Jefferson didn't sleep that night, and neither did the country. Justice was being uncovered not through promises but through data that could no longer be erased. On the 3rd night after the federal investigation was launched, the 12th floor of FBI headquarters in Washington was still lit. Alyssa stood by the large window watching the slow-moving traffic below. Inside the office, stacks of files and screens looped footage from the recovered data. The air was thick with focus and fatigue, but something steady remained in her gaze. The door door creaked open, and a man entered, the veteran FBI advisor who had trained her in her early years. He carried a folder stamped in red, walked slowly toward her, and said in a low voice, part praise, part warning, "You know what's unique about this, Alyssa. You're not just a victim. You're the link that broke the silence." Alyssa turned light, reflecting off her face, her eyes calm, neither proud nor avoiding. She set her coffee down, her voice soft but firm. "We didn't break the silence. We made it hear itself." The words made him pause, nodding slowly, pride and worry flickering in his eyes. He knew she wasn't speaking with arrogance, but with the deep belief that justice doesn't come from shouting. It comes from making people hear what they've long refused to. Alyssa walked to the desk and opened the file. Inside was a list of cases recovered from deleted data, no longer abstract numbers, but lives, faces that had been forgotten. She stared at the first line as if reading a buried piece of history. The link that broke the silence, the phrase echoed in her mind. It brought back the image of that morning on Federal Street when she fell onto cold stone, when blood from her lip touched the ground. Now that memory no longer carries pain, but proof that truth can rise from moments that once seemed small. She whispered almost to herself, if one kick could force the system to face the truth, maybe what it feared most was never justice, but someone who dares demanded answers. The advisor smiled, his eyes a mix of pride and concern. "Do you know what happens next, Alyssa? When silence is torn open, it fights back. The ones who thrived in the dark won't go quietly." Alyssa answered calmly, without a trace of fear. "I know. But every time we turn on the light, there's one less corner left in the dark." She sat down and began signing a new set of file subpoenas for 3 senior officers suspected of manipulating investigation report. Each stroke of the pen was a clear decision, like a clean cut through the thick silence of the system. Outside the glass, the city was lit buildings, reflecting light off one another, forming a silver line stretching to the horizon. Alyssa looked up and saw her reflection mixed in with the glow. She thought of those who had spoken up, the student who filmed the video, the young officer who sent the anonymous tip, and the citizens who raised their signs in the street that night. They were all links in the same chain of awakening. None of them needed to be heroes. They only needed to speak the truth. The advisor left the room, leaving Alyssa alone, the pale blue glow of the screen. She stood gently, placed her hand on the file in front of her, her gaze steady. Her earlier words still echoed in the air, clear and powerful, like a silent vow. "We didn't break the silence. We made it hear itself." And the night in Washington stayed bright, as if even the windows were listening. The morning of the federal trial was forecast to be the most significant moment in Jefferson's history. From early on, hundreds of residents lined up outside the courthouse carrying signs and eyes full of expectation. Inside the courtroom was packed, every seat filled by press attorneys and witnesses of the incident. Studio lights beamed down on the center stage where the defendant's bench stood still. Dean Harlow sat there, face pale, hands on his lap, eyes avoiding every lens. In front of him were rows of broadcast cameras capturing every movement, every breath. And behind him, the wooden plaque, carved with United States District Court, stood silent, emanating its unspoken authority. When the court bell rang, the entire room rose. The judge entered, black robe sweeping the floor, eyes stern as they scanned the room. The air thickened. A few whispers died off quickly as the judge struck the gavel and declared the session open. On the left, the federal prosecution team stood, led by a gray-haired prosecutor known for taking on police abuse cases. Her voice rang out, every word cutting through the space. The defendant, Dean Harlow, is charged with assault, racial discrimination, obstruction of federal duty, and intentional falsification of procedural reports. The charges echoed through the courtroom, and the room held its breath. Some in the gallery nodded slowly, others wept, knowing this wasn't just a trial of a man, but of a mindset buried deep in power. Harlow remained motionless, eyes dull, face stripped of its former defiance. His defense attorney kept his head down, scribbling, but tension was clear in his face. Across the room, Alyssa sat in the witness gallery, calm gaze steady, free of hatred, free of fear. When called to the stand, she walked slowly, spine straight, hands resting lightly on the wooden rail. The prosecutor asked, voice calm but sharp, "Chief Grant, can you recount what happened that morning?" Alyssa answered, each sentence precise, nothing added, nothing withheld. She spoke of the insult, the kick, the blood on the steps, and the eyes of a man who believed he could act without question. Every other sound faded her voice, steady, both testimony and historical record. When asked about the final moment, she looked directly at the defendant, her voice dropping. What I saw in his eyes wasn't confusion. It was satisfaction. And in that moment, I knew what needed to change wasn't just behavior, but the mindset. The courtroom fell silent. The camera lights reflected off her face, casting the image of a woman who had walked through humiliation and now stood for a generation ready to end fear. The defense attorney stood to argue, speaking of professional reflexes and loss of control under pressure. But no one in the room believed it. Every excuse sounded hollow next to the video, the evidence, and the stories of dozens of other victims revealed in the federal investigation. The judge remained silent, but his eyes fixed on Harlow, making it clear this sentence could not end with just a few years in prison. The trial lasted until noon. When the gavel struck to close the first session, applause erupted outside and chants of justice for all echoed through the streets. Harlow was escorted out in complete silence from the cameras while Alyssa stayed in the courtroom, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, casting a bright streak across her face. It wasn't the light of victory, but of truth finally brought before the public. And out there, Jefferson felt like it had taken one more step out of the long shadow of silence. Harlow stood, voice thin, clinging to fragile confidence. "I didn't know she was the FBI chief," then quickly added practiced phrases about instinct work, pressure, and mistaken identity. The defense attorney carefully threaded through those gaps, citing discipline training and the weight borne by officers in the field, as if each word could soften what had already occurred. The prosecutor didn't allow the silence to stretch. Her voice, cold and clear, pressed into the facts. The woman had held a file, had answered, had stood upright in public, and multiple phones had captured it all. She presented the evidence, then asked each word sharp as a blade. And if she wasn't, did he still have the right to kick her? The question hit the room like a test, and applause broke out first, scattered, then rising louder as the community responded to the absurdity. The applause shifted the air, made some in the gallery turn away to hide their instinctive reaction, and sent a chill through Harlow. His gaze dropped, face pale, all previous posture gone, leaving only a man clinging to whatever image he hoped others still saw. The cameras moved slowly across his face, catching flickers of fear, new lines etched across his forehead. In the witness stand, Alyssa stood still, her eyes locked on him, needing no more words. It wasn't a look of triumph, but of someone watching a long normalized behavior laid bare. That gaze stirred something in the room, urging those present to question their own silence, past or ongoing. The prosecutor continued, refusing to let mistake become a shield for violence. She opened internal records, played recovered videos, and presented recurring patterns from the same group, illustrating a chain where power was used not to protect but to punish. Each video shown made the air heavier, faces in the room tensed, and a few turned away to hide their tears. Harlow looked around, searching for a sympathetic gaze, but found only firm expressions, people who had suffered long before the system revealed its true face. The judge tapped lightly, reminding the room to stay orderly, but the gesture couldn't contain the emotions breaking through. Reporters whispered, pens kept moving, cameras kept flashing, and the sound of applause had become the crowd's signal of shared recognition. Harlow bowed his head while Alyssa drew a long breath, as if bearing an added weight. She knew this moment wouldn't end with applause, but was merely a pin driven into the tear, newly revealed one that now everyone could see beneath the fabric of authority. When the hearing paused, the silence that followed was not like the first day. It carried weight, the kind that signaled a shift in perception. Alyssa stepped softly back to her seat, not to celebrate, but to quietly observe the reactions of supervisors, witnesses, and citizens. She knew many steps remained: evidence to secure, testimonies to verify, and a system to hold accountable. The trial would go on, but the moment when the prosecutor turned the question toward the essence of power and authority, followed by rising applause, would be recalled as a turning point when the city and the nation began to realize that questioning what had long been accepted was the first step toward change. Day 3 of the trial began with an unusual silence. The courtroom was more crowded than ever, with new faces present, among them a man in police uniform, tired-looking eyes downcast, stepping up to the witness stand. His name was Robert Kane, an officer from Harlow's unit. His voice was hoarse, each sentence cutting into the wall of silence the force had upheld for years. "I served under Officer Harlow for 3 years. He began gripping his cap in front of him, and I witnessed things I can no longer keep hidden." The courtroom went still, every eye fixed on him. He took a deep breath, glanced briefly at Harlow, then said firmly, "He once bragged about kicking down a black man to make an example." He said it in the break room right after the shift on Federal Street. He laughed and said the guy needed to be taught a lesson. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some people shot to their feet, and the judge had to bang the gavel to restore order. Alyssa sat still, her gaze unchanged, but her hands clenched on her lap. Every word from that officer confirmed what she had known from the start. The prosecutor approached the stand and asked slowly, "Are you certain those were the defendant's words?" Robert replied without hesitation, "I can't forget, because he said it with pride, and because after working with him for years, I know he never made mistakes. He picked who to dominate." The air turned heavy, every camera locked onto Harlow. His face had gone pale, lips parting, then closing as if choking on something lodged in his throat. His defense attorney turned toward him, but said nothing, flipping through files, knowing every exit had just closed. The old defenses of procedure failure and instinctive response now sounded like a joke. The prosecutor didn't press further. She simply looked at Harlow, her eyes cold like mirrors reflecting a stripped-down truth. "Do you deny your teammate's testimony?" she asked, voice low but firm. Harlow shook his head. His lips moved faintly, but no sound came out. The judge leaned forward, voice slow and steady. "This court will weigh this testimony along with existing evidence, but if what he says is true, this is not just assault but a targeted act driven by hate." The words sealed it. Harlow bowed his head, hands clenched on the table, knuckles white. The camera lights glinted off his damp hair, sweat visible now. The room was utterly silent, save for the wind at the window and the soft hum of the audio recorder. As Robert Kane stepped down, he passed Harlow without looking, but spoke softly enough for the mic catch. "I stayed silent out of fear, but today I speak so I can sleep again." The words shook the room, followed by a long, heavy silence, no longer one of concealment, but of reckoning. Alyssa bowed her head, eyes closed, a trace of sorrow on her face, not from satisfaction, but because she knew true justice isn't about defeating someone, it's about beginning to return a voice to those it was once taken from. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as Harlow finally lifted his head, his eyes clouded, as if he'd glimpsed the outer limit of himself. He exhaled, voice hoarse and heavy, hanging in the thick air. "I only did what everyone else does and no one talks about." It didn't sound like a defense, but a surrender, an admission that the system had always stood behind him. He looked around, searching for a sympathetic gaze, but former colleagues looked away, some bowed their heads, others turned aside. In that moment, his confession exposed the harshest truth: his misconduct wasn't random. It had been fed by collective silence, by fear of speaking, by habits left unchecked over the years. His words sliced through the moral mask many had tried to wear. The prosecutor stood tall, gripping her file, her face a mix of anger and pity. "And it's exactly because everyone does it and no one talks about it," she said, "that people like you believe violence is just part of the job. But Today, no one gets to call it normal anymore. A few in the gallery nodded their eyes, shifting to Alyssa as if looking for confirmation. She rose slowly, stepped forward, her voice low, so clear that every word struck the wooden walls. "That's why I'm here." Her words stilled the room. Afternoon light from the window cut across her face, forming a sharp line between right and wrong. Alyssa didn't scan the room. She looked straight at Harlow, gaze steady, no longer angry, just someone confronting a truth long understood. Cruelty is born from the comfort of silence. "You said you did what everyone else does," she continued. "Then I'll do what no one else has done. I will speak, not for revenge, but to end the silence that allows men like you to exist." Each word slowed the breath in the room. Some people bowed their heads, others wiped their eyes. Harlow lowered his face, hands, clenched shoulders trembling slightly, whether from shame or fear it wasn't clear. Cameras moved slowly, capturing it all. The man who once believed power gave him the right to stand above others, now forced by truth to bow his head. Alyssa turned and walked back to her seat, her face calm, her eyes saying enough. From the judge's bench, the gavel tapped once, the sound spreading through the chamber like justice exhaling. In the gallery, the man who had lost his son to police violence looked up, his eyes wet, whispering to the person beside him, "She's speaking for us." Others nodded as if Alyssa's words weren't just a response, but the beginning of something larger. In the corner, a reporter scribbled the quote, knowing it would headline every front page the next morning, "That's why I'm here." As the trial ended, the late afternoon sun slipped through the window, casting a pale gold over the empty benches. Alyssa stood at the courthouse steps watching the crowd gathered outside, her face calm. Inside, she knew justice does not end with a verdict, but in the awakening of those who once stayed silent. And today, at least one person had stopped to listen, one had dared to speak, and one city had begun to learn how not to be silent anymore. 3 months after the trial ended, America entered what the press called the era of federal justice awakening. From months of protests, from millions of reform calls, and from Alyssa Grant's voice echoing across broadcasts, the federal government officially passed the Federal Conduct Transparency Act. The bill passed with near unanimous support, marking a major shift in law enforcement history. For the first time, all arrests, interrogations, and civilian interactions by law enforcement were required to be recorded and publicly stored in a federal database. Any deletion, editing, or intentional falsification would be considered a criminal offense. Every line of the law mirrored what Jefferson had lived through, making it clear nationwide that transparency was no longer a privilege, but an obligation. On the day the law was signed, thousands gathered outside the Capitol, holding banners that read, "Justice demands witnesses." On the giant screen above the square, the image of the president signing the bill was accompanied by a wave of applause. News outlets called it the law born from a 1-minute video recalling the clip of Alyssa being attacked on Federal Street, a moment that forced an entire system to confront itself. Simultaneously, the Department of Justice and FBI launched a new data protocol. Every law enforcement body camera would stream directly to a federal server, allowing random checks and regulated public access. The dry language of legislation had now become the symbol of truth that could no longer be buried. The international press called it the Jefferson effect, a ripple from a small city that changed how a nation viewed power and responsibility. On TV, citizens in many states said they felt safer knowing all encounters between civilians and police were being recorded. Police academies were ordered to update their curricula, adding a mandatory course titled Human Integrity and Transparency. The first sessions opened with Alyssa's video projected on a large screen, not to dwell on failure, but to teach the limits of power. Alyssa accepted an invitation to join the Department of Justice's advisory panel overseeing implementation of the new law. At a press conference, when asked how she felt about the bill bearing traces of her own story, she answered simply, "I was just the first to stand up, but change came from everyone who chose not to turn away." That reply was shared everywhere, becoming the signature quote of the growing transparency first movement. In Jefferson, where it all began, new cameras were installed on every patrol car. On the wall of the police headquarters, a bronze plaque was placed with an engraved quote from the law, "Every act must be seen." Those who once stayed silent had begun to speak, and those who once feared were now standing to tell their stories. And as the evening sun set on the dome of the old courthouse, golden light washed over the engraved words, reflecting across the street where a woman once fell, and from there justice began to take shape, gain a voice, and find witnesses. Right after the Federal Conduct Transparency Act was passed, police departments nationwide pushed back hard. Many in the force claimed that recording and public data access would limit autonomy and make their work feel over-surveilled. Major police unions held press conferences declaring the law undermines morale and puts officers under suspicion before they even act. Some states even filed petitions to delay enforcement, citing high operational costs. On the nightly news, images of officers standing outside precincts holding signs that read "Trust the Badge" aired repeatedly, but behind them, public backlash surged. On social media, hashtags like "We Deserve Proof" and "No More Shadows" spread fast as millions reshared Alyssa's old video, a reminder that this resistance wasn't about justice, but about fear of accountability. Outside the Capitol, crowds of citizens gathered holding signs that read, "Transparency protects the honest." That phrase echoed through interviews, student speeches, and chants every time a law enforcement official voiced opposition. The louder the complaints, the more people saw the obvious. If someone's doing the right thing, they have no reason to fear being seen. The media covered waves of civil rights groups, lawyers, and even honest former officers voicing support for the law, affirming that transparency doesn't kill the profession, it saves its honor. Every speech, every sign lifted was another heartbeat in a reform movement spreading nationwide. In that climate, Alyssa was invited to speak at the National Enforcement Conference. The event was broadcast live, watched by millions. As she stepped to the podium, the room fell silent. Tension hung in the air. Many high-ranking officers were present, some of whom had strongly opposed the law. Alyssa paused at the microphone light from above, reflecting off the gold badge on her chest. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm and clear, each word halting the room. No one gets to act in the dark and call it duty. The sentence cut through years of built-up excuses like a blade. She continued, her voice lower but still steady. True duty is not about holding power, but about protecting trust. And if trust has to live in the dark, it will die with justice. For a few seconds, the room was completely silent. Then, applause broke out from the back rows, spreading across the hall. Reporters stood, scribbling quickly, while many officers sat still, their expressions shifting from resistance to reflection. A member of the Federal Police Board approached and shook Alyssa's hand, his voice low. "You just said what many of us always wanted to, but never had the courage." She only smiled, said nothing, then stepped down and blended into the crowd. Outside the conference, people waited for her to emerge, clapping and chanting her name, but Alyssa only bowed her head in thanks. She knew real change doesn't come from applause, but from each small brick being laid into the foundation of an old system. As night fell, the Capitol building stayed brightly lit, and across the news her words replayed thousands of times. Everywhere, from Jefferson to New York, from small precincts to major academies, a message began to embed itself in the public mind. Justice only exists when light is allowed to reach every shadow. On sentencing day, light rain fell over Jefferson. Droplets hit the federal courthouse steps, echoing like the steady breath of a city waiting for an answer. The courtroom was packed tension so thick no one seemed to breathe. The judge sat upright, his voice slow and firm, each word dropping like a stone into a still lake. "Dean Harlow, this federal court sentences you to 12 years in prison for assault, abuse of power, obstruction of federal duty, and systemic racial discrimination. Additionally, you are permanently stripped of your badge and barred from serving in any law enforcement agency nationwide. The gavel struck with finality, closing a long chapter of silence. In that moment, no one cheered, no one clapped, because they all knew this was not a victory, but the beginning of a long healing. Harlow sat still, his face pale, hands opening and closing, eyes lost between regret and resentment. As officers approached, he looked up at Alyssa, seated in the front row, lips trembling, before whispering, "You killed my career." The words thickened the air. Some exchanged glances, some looked down, but Alyssa didn't react. She met his gaze silent, as if looking into what was left of a man who once believed he stood above others. Then she answered, calm and clear enough for all to hear, "I didn't kill it. You did that yourself." Her words made him lower his head, shoulders collapsing under the weight of truth. Light from the window struck the silver cuffs on his wrists, glinting against the gray morning, a symbol as brutal as it was necessary. Outside, reporters swarmed cameras fixed on the doorway as justice officers escorted him out. Across the live feed, the headline scrolled, "Justice served. Harlow sentenced to 12 years sharp and cold." As the convoy left the courthouse, Alyssa stepped outside, watching the rain fall on Federal Street, where it all began. She felt no joy, no relief. Sentences had limits, but change lived beyond the bars. She remembered her mentor's words. Law can judge a man, but only awakening can judge a system. Now, seeing the crowd outside the gate, she understood that more than ever. A group of students held a handwritten sign, 12 years for one man, but truth for a nation. Alyssa walked slowly down the stone steps, her shoes leaving wet prints on the old ground, eyes set on the distance. Above the courthouse dome, the national flag flew in the rain, heavy and proud. Below, the people watched in silence, no words spoken, only the sound of rain blending with the quiet hum of cameras capturing the day justice was served. To Alyssa, today's sentence was not just for one man, but for the many years this country had closed its eyes to wrongdoing. And as she walked away, she knew it wasn't Harlow's career that ended, but an era of impunity beginning to close. Harlow stood frozen in the courtroom, eyes, tired hair disheveled from days in custody. Light cut through the window, revealing cracks on a face once shielded by long-held arrogance. As the officers approached, he turned to Alyssa, voice hoarse from sleepless nights, speaking in broken breath. "You killed me. You killed my whole career." Alyssa stood still, gaze fixed on him, not with hatred, not with pride, but with the calm of someone who had moved past anger and reached the edge of justice. She answered, voice quiet but sharp, "I didn't kill anything. I just brought light to where you were hiding." Her words echoed through the courtroom, weaving through rows of seats, reaching those who had stayed silent, making them bow their heads, as if seeing themselves in the shattered mirror of the system. For a moment, Harlow paused, lips trembling, but said nothing more. Perhaps for the first time he realized what had broken him was not a woman, but the truth, what he had avoided for years. Reporters behind captured the moment, lenses fixed on Alyssa, standing tall in the light, and Harlow hunched low, his shadow stretched across the cold floor like a period closing a chapter. On the bench, the judge lifted the gavel, eyes sweeping across the silent crowd. He tapped once, then twice, and the third strike rang out like a final word. The sentence was closed, the long years of cover-ups ended. The sound echoed off the walls and ceiling, filling the courtroom with the weight of a rewritten chapter. The audience remained still, a few elders teary-eyed, some reporters pausing mid-keystroke. The air thickened, both heavy and clear. A woman in the last row, who had lost her son to police violence, whispered to the person beside her. Someone finally turned the light on. That quiet sentence settled like a warm ending to a long, dark time. As Harlow was led away, the soft clink of cuffs joined the sound of rain falling outside. Alyssa watched, not in triumph, but in reflection. She knew no sentence could undo years of harm. But at least it was a beginning, a moment when justice stepped off the page and into view seen with real eyes and held by real trust. She took a deep breath, the cold rain brushing her skin as she left the courthouse, her heart lighter but not empty. Outside, Jefferson Square was packed people, standing in the rain, holding umbrellas, raising signs that read, "Light winds." When they saw her, the crowd fell silent, then bowed their heads all at once, a gesture simpler than any thank you. Alyssa looked at them, a faint smile forming as the echo of the final gavel beat like the steady pulse of a city newly awakened. The chaos of years of cover-up seemed to dissolve into the rain. On the stone steps where she once fell, the water spread and faded, leaving the surface clean and clear. In that moment, Jefferson was no longer a place that people avoided naming, but proof that once light is allowed in to where darkness lived, the dark can never fully return. The morning after the trial, Jefferson was soaked in thick rain, the sky seeming to wash away what remained from the stormy days before. On the federal courthouse steps, dozens of reporters crowded together, raincoats catching the lights, microphones raised. The wooden doors opened, and Alyssa Grant stepped down, dark coat, soaked wet hair clinging to her forehead, but her face still bright against the gray sky. Camera shutters, snapped voices called her name, but she walked slowly, saying nothing. Amid the crowd, a small boy stood out thin, pressed against the railing, holding up a sign made from old cardboard, the words painted in shaky white, "Thank you, Chief Grant." The letters were trembling, but strong enough to quiet the moment. Alyssa stopped, her gaze softened, and she walked toward the boy, muddy shoes marking the wet stone. He looked up, brown eyes wide, a shy smile on his face. "I saw your video," he said, voice shaking in the rain. "My mom says because of you, people believe justice is still real." Alyssa leaned down, touched the sign, rain mixing with the tears on his cheek, and answered gently, "Thank you, but don't thank me. Thank you, MM, for teaching you to believe in what's right." The words made him smile, his lips purple from the cold, but his eyes shining brighter than the sun hidden behind the clouds. Reporters surrounded them, capturing the moment without commentary. It spoke for itself. The woman who once fell on those steps now knelt before the future of justice. Alyssa left the courthouse, walking past the crowd still standing in the rain. They didn't cheer or clap, just watched in silence as if committing her image to the memory of a wounded city. Each step left a trail of water blending into the current, washing away trash dust and the remnants of a historic storm. Around town, shops displayed signs quoting her words. "No one gets to act in the dark and call it duty." Simple, but it became the slogan of the new Jefferson, a place where light had found its ground. As her car pulled away from downtown, Alyssa looked out the window, seeing dozens of citizens in the rain holding up phones not to chase a headline but to record real change. On a corner, a group of high schoolers posted signs reading "Justice is public" on the wall, their faces alive with the kind of belief she once thought the world had lost. The sight made her smile. Her fight didn't end in court. It was just beginning in those young hands. As the car turned onto Federal Avenue, where it all began, she saw the steps where she once fell, now clean with a white bouquet laid at the spot. No one knew who placed it, but in her heart she understood Jefferson had learned how to remember without hate, how to face its past without fear. The rain kept falling, but instead of heaviness, it felt like a cleansing, pulling the city out of its long-held darkness. Alyssa closed her eyes gently, resting her hand on the window, feeling the cold seep through, then whispered as if to herself, "Justice doesn't begin in a courtroom. It begins with trust." Outside, a faint light broke through the clouds, reflecting off the Jefferson Courthouse sign, glowing softly in the rain like a quiet period to an old chapter and the beginning of a new one in awakening. Alyssa leaned down, rain still falling and heavy waves, flashlights bursting around her. But in that moment, everything stepped back, giving space to her and the small boy standing under the silver-gray sky. She nodded, gently placing a hand on his shoulder, her voice low and warm, as if spoken from the depth of resolve. "Thank you for believing justice is still real." The boy looked up, wide eyes lit with unshaken faith, still clutching the wet sign. The words, "Thank you, Chief Grant," smeared but more clear in meaning than ever. The light from the cameras reflected off the golden badge on her chest, casting a glow stronger than any flash cutting through the frame, making those watching feel as if they were seeing a symbol, not just a person. That moment spread across social media within hours, becoming the defining image of the day Jefferson stepped out of the dark. Headlines read, "Light on the badge, the moment America saw itself." Thousands of comments poured in. Many said they cried watching her bow to the child, because in that small act was a reminder justice is not power, but the handing back of trust to the next generation. In classrooms, teachers showed the image during civics and students debated justice as a lived act. An older woman wrote in a post, shared hundreds of thousands of times I had lost faith in the system, but when I saw her bend to that child, I knew justice wasn't dead. It just needed the right name. Alyssa didn't read all of what people wrote. She left the media center after answering a few brief questions, walking down the rain-soaked street quietly, watching storefront windows reflect her face between the passing cars. She knew the light on her badge that day wasn't a miracle, but the result of thousands who had the courage to speak record, stand up, and believe in what's right. Each of them was part of that light. She smiled, hand touching the golden badge, feeling warmth spread into her palm as if thousands of untold stories were resting there waiting to be continued in action, not words. In the distance, on the large digital screen in the square, the video of her placing a hand on the boy's shoulder played on loop during the memorial for victims of abuse of power. The background music was solemn, the narrator's voice steady. One lights the way the whole city sees. When the video ended, the stadium lights flared, illuminating the words carved into the new stone wall in front of the courthouse, "Justice lives where truth is seen." That line was placed just beneath a bronze plaque bearing her name, but Alyssa never wanted it to be about her. What mattered more to her were the small bouquets left beneath the words, the handwritten notes from Jefferson's people promising they would never let silence cover the city again. That evening, when Alyssa returned to her office, she sat by the window watching the rain still fall in scattered drops. On her desk was a photo sent by a reporter the moment she bowed her head and touched the boy's shoulder, the golden badge glowing like a spark in the rain. She stared at it for a long time, then turned it over where the reporter had written a short line. "Thank you for helping us believe light can be seen." She folded the photo, placed it in a drawer, along with her mother's old letter, the one that reminded her that courage is not the absence of fear, but the will to keep walking, knowing you might fall. Outside, the rain began to ease, and the first rays of light pierced through the clouds, casting a pale reflection across the window, landing exactly on the badge resting on her desk. That light was calm, soft, not as bright as a flash, but steady, enduring, like what Alyssa had once said during the first hearing, justice doesn't need to be proven by noise, but by the light that remains when the noise is gone. In that small room within a city just reborn, the light kept spreading from the badge, from memory, and from the trust a young boy carried in 4 trembling words on his sign, "Thank you, Chief Grant." After the trial and the days of rain ended, Jefferson entered its post-reform era. The change was not just in new laws or the declarative plaques now standing, but in the attitude of those who once held power in law enforcement. A wave of senior officers submitted their resignations, and names once seen beside Harlow in headlines quietly disappeared from the ranks. They were not forced out, they chose to leave. In short letters sent to the Oversight Committee, many wrote the same words. "We thought we were doing right, but now we understand silence is complicity." Some left quietly, others publicly acknowledged their failures. The sight shocked the nation as it marked one of the rare times police leadership admitted collective wrongdoing. Jefferson, once viewed as a symbol of abuse, had now become a birthplace of truth. In the weeks that followed, major newspapers published a series of interviews titled "Those Who Stayed Silent." The stories of officers recounting the moments they chose silence in the face of injustice were written in such detail that many readers were moved to tears. One former captain said, "I didn't hit anyone, but I walked. Now I know that kind of cowardice is no different from violence." These confessions spread across forums, becoming becoming a catalyst for broader conversations about professional ethics across the field. Conferences and forums opened in many states where former badge holders stood up to share lessons on the limits of authority and the courage it takes to defend the truth. At the same time, police academies nationwide updated their training programs. In the new public ethics course, the Alyssa Grant case was introduced as mandatory study. The image of her stepping into the rain light reflecting off the gold badge was shown in the first session of every rookie class. One instructor told his students, "Remember, every time you draw your weapon or speak a command, it's not just a procedure, it's a statement of character." Classrooms fell silent until someone asked, "Will she come back to teach?" and the instructor replied, eyes on the screen, "She doesn't need to, because the greatest lesson is already in her story." In Jefferson, the Department of Justice opened a training center for transparency and accountability headquartered in the old building that once served as Harlow's office. Everything remained the same from the gray walls to the dark wooden doors. But inside, the fear and shouting were gone, replaced by rows of desks and a whiteboard with the phrase, "Justice has no privilege." Locals called it the House of Redemption. Each year, hundreds of officers were sent there for training, and in the main hall, a photo of Alyssa standing beside the boy holding the sign, "Thank you, Chief Grant," hung at the center. From Washington to Texas, politicians, scholars, and everyday citizens looked to Jefferson as proof that change, no matter how slow, can come when someone has the courage to do what is right. For Alyssa, everything felt like a closed circle. She did not attend honor ceremonies or speak at major conferences, yet her name was mentioned in every ethics class and every swearing-in ceremony of new officers. Somewhere, someone repeated her words from the hearing, "Justice is not the end. It is a reminder to begin again with a cleaner conscience." Jefferson had begun again, and this time justice was not seen through a verdict, but through the light reflected in the eyes of those who had stepped out of the dark. During a lecture at the National Academy of Law and Enforcement, in a hall full of young students, Professor Ethan Rowe, a former federal prosecutor in many high-profile cases, paused in the middle of his class to display the image of Alyssa Grant in the rain that day. The entire room fell silent, no pens scribbling, no chairs shifting. He pointed to the photo and spoke slowly. "You study rights duties in the law, but what no book can teach you is respect for humanity, because strength does not lie in the badge, but in respecting human beings." His voice was steady, but carried the weight of someone who had seen both the bright and the dark sides of justice. His words left the class in complete silence, and some students looked up, eyes lit, as if realizing that power without humanity becomes only a tool of domination. After the class, many lingered longer than usual, looking up at the screen showing Alyssa, as if trying to hold on to something that went far beyond any test. The story of Jefferson and the woman with the gold badge became a core part of the curriculum in dozens of law schools, police academies, and public ethics institutes. A new generation of students saw her as a symbol of resolve, not for rank or title, but for how she chose to stay silent at the right time and speak at the right place. An academic paper titled "The Grant Effect: When Courage Reaches a System" gained wide attention in the field of social research. In it, the author wrote, "Change does not come from loud chants, but from acts strong enough to make people reflect on themselves." Outside of academia, ordinary people carried her story everywhere, from small cafes in Jefferson to grand halls in Washington. Alyssa knew all of this, but she did not live in the spotlight of praise. Each day she still came to the office as before, reading reports, reviewing files, and signing off on new investigation plans. On her desk, stacks of handwritten letters and emails from across the country piled up from mothers who lost their children, young cadets newly sworn into people once forgotten by the system. They wrote to thank her, to share their stories, to say that because of her they believed justice was no longer a distant concept. Someone sent a hand-drawn card with a simple line, You made us believe again." She read every letter, smiled, folded them carefully, and placed them in a small wooden box in her drawer. That was how she kept them, not displayed, not flaunted, but as quiet proof of trust being restored. On weekend afternoons, Alyssa often left the office late, walking through the park by the lake where Jefferson residents gathered. Sometimes she saw students discussing the new transparency law or young officers training with body cameras. They recognized her, nodded in greeting, but she simply smiled and kept walking. Her presence in the city carried no aura of authority, but felt like a natural breath part of Jefferson's life after the storm. She understood that justice never ends with one case or one sentence. It is the ongoing process of people learning how to treat each other better. As the sun set, its light reflected off the old Federal building where her gold badge had once shone, and Alyssa looked on more certain than ever that justice only truly exists when people have the courage to respect each other even when no one is watching. 1 year after the historic trial, Jefferson had changed almost beyond recognition. The streets once marked by stigma were now filled with flags, the old walls repainted with murals about justice and dignity. In the city center, right in front of the federal courthouse, the government unveiled a white marble memorial engraved with the words, "She stood, she fought, she changed the system." The line, carved deep and gleaming in the morning sun, became the square's focal point. People gathered around it, carrying flowers, cards, and letters. They didn't come to honor a person, but to remember a moment that helped the city recover its lost soul. On the plaque, just below the inscription, was a photo of Alyssa, smiling her eyes, looking into the distance, the light softly catching the familiar gold badge. The ceremony was simple, but moving. The mayor, who had once defended Harlow, stood at the microphone and admitted his voice breaking. "I once believed that order mattered more than truth, but she taught us that justice cannot exist if we are afraid to face our mistakes." The line was quoted across evening newscasts, repeated like Jefferson's collective confession. Hundreds stood around, some had witnessed the events, others were younger and only knew the story through footage. They placed flowers, some touched the engraved words, some stood silently for a long time, as if to thank someone who had stood through the storm on their behalf. As the sun rose higher, its light passed through the courthouse's glass walls, shining directly on the memorial, making the gold badge and Alyssa's photo glow as if it were real. A young woman holding a bouquet of white daisies stepped forward gently, laid them at the base of the plaque, and whispered, "You made me believe justice isn't just a myth." A journalist captured the moment, and it quickly spread across social media. The image of the young woman standing beside the glowing plaque became a new symbol shared millions of times. In the comments, people didn't talk about guilt politics or systems, but about courage, resolve, and the belief Alyssa had reignited. At the same time, in other cities, smaller memorials were built bearing the same inscription, always paired with her now famous quote, "No one gets to act in the dark and call it duty." Schools, offices, and city halls displayed the line not as a slogan but as a reminder of the boundary between power and morality. The children growing up after the incident knew Alyssa not through scandal or sensational headlines, but through the image of a woman who chose to do what was right even when it meant standing against an entire system. At night, when Jefferson is quiet, the memorial is lit by a row of soft yellow lights. The words, "She stood, she fought, she changed the system," reflect on the surface of the small pond in front of the courthouse, like a beam of light stretching into infinity. People often walk by, stop, sometimes, just to glance up before moving on, but no one passes without feeling something stir inside. An old man once told his grandchild, "This used to be a place people were afraid to come near. Now it's where they come to believe." On the 1-year anniversary, Alyssa came too quietly without informing the media. She stood among the crowd, cap pulled low glow, watching the stacked bouquets at the base of the photo. When the light hit the gold badge engraved in the stone, she paused, pulled a white rose from her coat pocket, placed it down, and bowed her head. The evening breeze stirred a few petals, dropping them into a puddle that reflected her face in the warm glow. In that moment, Jefferson was no longer a city in pain, but a place that had learned how to heal. And in the heart of that city, people didn't just see a plaque, they saw themselves standing, fighting, and changing, as Alyssa once did. That afternoon, Jefferson was bathed in soft sunlight, the memorial glinting like a mirror in the square. People came and went steadily, bringing flowers, cards, and handwritten notes. Among the daisies, roses, and thank you signs, a small piece of paper lay beneath the base of the stone, tilted by the wind. An event staffer picked it up about to place it in the keepsake box, then paused after reading the handwritten blue ink line, "Forgiveness is justice, too." The handwriting was steady, not shaky like that of someone who had lived through mud. Below the line was an unclear signature, only two initials, D.H. A rumor spread quickly that it had been left by a former officer who resigned after last year's trial. No one confirmed it, but everyone understood its meaning. An unspoken apology, a late but honest reckoning. When Alyssa arrived, the ceremony was nearly over. The crowd had thinned, leaving only the sound of wind brushing the flagpole and water dripping from the courthouse eaves. She walked slowly, passing dew-soaked bouquets, reading handwritten notes, bits of poetry, words of thanks, and words of regret. Among them, the white paper with the blue lettering stood out, simple but powerful. She bent down, picked it up, read each word slowly, letting them settle in her heart. Forgiveness is justice, too. She pressed her lips together as if holding back a smile, then folded the note carefully and placed it in her coat pocket. She didn't need to know who wrote it. She felt the sincerity in every stroke, from someone who had once stood on the other side, now understanding that justice does not only come from judgment, but from the power to heal. The late afternoon sun angled across her shoulder, reflecting off the gold badge on her chest, making the entire square seem brighter. Alyssa stood still for a moment, her eyes fixed on the memorial plaque where the words, "She stood, she fought, she changed the system," shimmered in the sunset. She smiled softly, a smile light yet deep, as if offered to the past, to those who once caused pain, and to those who chose to rise and change. She understood that forgiveness does not mean forgetting, but choosing to stop giving the past the power to hurt the present. In that calm, Jefferson seemed to slow down as if exhaling after years of being clenched tight. She turned away from the square, walking beneath rows of shedding trees. Behind her, those who happened to witness the moment said they saw her smile when the sunlight touched her face, and that face in the autumn afternoon looked as if it had just set down the weight of an entire era. A young reporter captured that photo later, naming it the smile of justice. The image spread everywhere with no caption needed, because anyone who saw it felt something words couldn't describe: the strength of grace after upheaval. Back at the office, Alyssa pulled the piece of paper from her coat pocket, folded it neatly, and placed it in the small keepsake box on her desk where she kept letters from all over. The white paper sat on top, standing out among hundreds of colorful envelopes. She touched its surface gently, speaking as if to an old friend. Yes, forgiveness is justice, too. Then she turned off the lights, leaving only the window's reflection glowing on the gold badge. Outside, Jefferson had fallen quiet, but in that small room the light continued to spread a quiet reminder that sometimes the final chapter of justice is not punishment, but the moment humanity finds its way back to compassion. News of Harlow's letter came on a late afternoon, just as Alyssa's office lights had gone dark, leaving only the glow from the window reflected on her desk. Her assistant placed the envelope on the table face, hesitant, as if afraid it might stir the memories Jefferson was trying to lay to rest. Alyssa quietly opened the envelope. Inside was a sheet of lined paper, the handwriting tilted and slow, a familiar script she had seen in old investigative reports. courts. The first line read, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to say what I couldn't back then." The letter was short, with no embellishment, no long apology, only the words of a man who had lost what he once believed untouchable. At the end, Harlow wrote, "I understand now, but the price of this clarity is too high." Alyssa finished reading, folded the letter, her eyes pausing on the scrawled signature. Dean Harlow, the man who once shook the entire system. A week later, she agreed to visit the federal prison. It was the first time they had seen each other since the day he was handcuffed in court. The prison stood on the outskirts, surrounded by high walls and strands of silver barbed wire shining under the sun. As she entered the visitation area, cold air and the scent of rust surrounded her. Harlow was already seated wearing a gray inmate uniform, his hair streaked with white, his face so gaunt he was nearly unrecognizable from the man who once stood proud before crowd. When Alyssa walked in, he lowered his head slightly, avoiding her gaze, his voice rough and subdued like someone who had forgotten how to speak. "Thank you for coming." She didn't reply, only sat down, hands folded, eyes steady. Harlow looked up, stared at her for a long moment, then said, "I used to think I was strong because people feared me. Now I know it was fear I planted, not respect." He paused, his voice cracking. "I understand now, but the price of this clarity is too high." The words echoed like a memory, making the silent room feel heavier. Alyssa looked at him, her eyes no longer those of a victim, but of someone listening to a soul just learning to face itself. "Clarity always comes at a price," she replied, "but you still have a chance to make it mean something." Harlow said nothing, his fingers stiff on the table. Then he nodded slowly, a crooked smile crossing his face like he wasn't yet used to the feeling. They spoke for over an hour, not about the incident, not about the trial, but about people and what makes a system go blind. Harlow talked about sleepless nights, about the image of Alyssa fallen outside the courthouse haunting him in the darkness of his cell. "I still hear my shoes from that moment," he said, "and I wish I had stopped." The sentence made Alyssa reach out gently, resting her hand on the steel table, where both their faces reflected faintly, a symbol of two sides once in conflict now sitting under the same dim light. Before leaving, she stood looking through the thick glass between them. "You can't change the past," she said softly, "but you can change how you live with it." Harlow looked up, and in his eyes a faint light flickered, small but real. As the lock clicked shut behind her, the metallic clang rang out sharply, but Alyssa didn't feel the weight of it. She stepped outside, took a deep breath, and felt the fresh air of the fading afternoon settle into her lungs. On the drive back, she looked out the window and saw the sun dipping behind the hills, its light cutting through the glass in a pale golden streak like a narrow way out from the dark. She knew she hadn't brought salvation to Harlow, but maybe in that meeting a part of the darkness had been named, and that was the beginning of light. Jefferson had since grown quieter, not because every wound was forgotten, but because someone had dared to face them to learn how to move forward. The visitation room was so silent that the sound of the steel door behind echoed longer than it should. Harlow sat with his head down, hands clenched, dim light catching on a face no longer like the man who once walked proudly down Federal Street. His voice was hoarse, almost breaking, as he said, "I understand now, but the price of this clarity is too high." Alyssa looked at him, calm, without judgment or pity. She replied slowly, each word falling onto the cold tile floor. "Any price is cheaper than silence." The sentence landed softly, but echoed deeply, a verdict, not from a courtroom, but from conscience. Harlow looked up, eyes wet and empty, his lips trembling like he wanted to speak but couldn't. A long moment passed, only the hum of the ceiling fan and the quiet scratch of a pen from the recording clerk breaking the stillness. He exhaled, leaning back in his chair, as if realizing the brutal truth that what he had lost wasn't just freedom, but the illusion that power had made him untouchable. Alyssa remained seated, hands resting in front of her gaze, distant. In her, there was no trace of vengeance, only the stillness of someone who had walked through the dark and understood that justice does not end with a sentence, but begins when a person chooses to face themselves. She looked at Harlow, his gaunt face, hands rough from prison labor, eyes dim but honest. "You think justice is something I did for you?" she said quietly, "but really, it's something you have to do for yourself." Harlow nodded slightly, a tired smile touching his lips, his eyes meeting hers as if searching for one last confirmation that this meeting had not been in vain. "Maybe," he whispered. "I'm too late to start again," Alyssa replied. "Starting again doesn't take time. It takes courage." She stood her chair scraping gently against the tile. Harlow bowed his head once more, his fingers locking together as if trying to hold on to something that had just slipped from reach. As she turned to leave, light from the small window fell across his shoulder, casting a pale band of glow. It was the first time since entering prison that Harlow let the light hit his face directly. As the door closed behind her, Alyssa paused, looking through the thick glass, where he still sat motionless. She saw not a man of arrogance, not the shell of false confidence, but the emptiness of someone hearing the sound of his own conscience for the first time. That emptiness, strangely enough, was a sign of awakening, because only when every outer layer collapses can a person truly see what's real inside. Outside the hallway stretched long, the yellow lights casting a faded tone on the old walls. She walked slowly, her footsteps steady, each one like a closing note. The door at the end of the hall opened, and the afternoon wind swept in, carrying the scent of damp earth. Alyssa stopped, inhaled deeply, letting the cold air fill her lungs, then exhaled, as if releasing something heavy she had carried for months. In the distance, the sky had shifted gray clouds mixed with the last strip of dusk, the light reflecting on the car windows, making everything glow for a moment. She looked back at the prison, at the high walls standing tall against the sky, and quietly said to herself, "Any price is worth it if it wakes someone up." On the way back, she didn't turn on the music or the radio. The city passed by through the window, every corner, every light familiar, yet changed. At the central intersection, she saw a group of students stopping in front of the memorial, reading the engraved words. She stood, she fought, she changed the system. The headlights reflected off the plaque, lighting up the street corner. Alyssa smiled softly, her hand tightening slightly on the wheel, a rare calm rising within her. She knew she hadn't saved Harlow, but she had done something more important, let light reach a place where darkness used to rule. And sometimes that alone is enough to change a life forever. The morning in Jefferson was calm, the sky clear after a night of light rain. Dawn spilled across rooftops, covered in dew, shining onto the central square, the place that once witnessed protests, raised signs, and the tears of a city that had learned how to wake up. Alyssa Grant walked slowly across the damp stone path, holding a white flower. The square now had no guards or barricades, only a bronze statue of her standing in the center, eyes facing the courthouse posture, upright, gaze steady. The early light struck the finely cast golden badge on the statue's chest, making it glimmer as if still carrying the warmth of a real person. At its base, hundreds of flower bouquets were piled with small letters and childlike drawings scrawled with the words, "Justice has a face." Alyssa knelt and placed her flower among the others, her hand brushing the cool stone, whispering softly, her voice low and thin, blending with the breeze. "Justice never shouts, it only needs to be heard." The words were so light they could vanish in the wind, yet it felt like the whole space heard them. A woman, standing a few steps away, paused, bowed her head, then quietly walked on. An elderly man, sitting on a bench, watched her, smiled, and nodded in agreement. Birds, chirping in the nearby trees, softened the solemn air, leaving a calm sense, as if Jefferson had entered an entirely new kind of morning. Alyssa looked up, watching the bronze reflect the sun, feeling a strange emotion rise within her. It wasn't her image she saw, but that of everyone who had ever stood up for what was right. She sat on a nearby bench, the same spot where people once shouted for justice. Now, only the soft spray from the fountain in the center of the lake and the scent of flowers and damp earth remained. She opened her bag and pulled out an old sheet of paper, the one a former officer had once left with the words, "Forgiveness is justice too." The paper was yellow, its folds worn, but the words remained bold and clear. She stared at it for a long time, then folded it again and placed it in her wallet as a reminder that even within justice, there's room for compassion. She smiled, eyes turning toward the distant Federal building where sunlight reflected off the windows like hundreds of small mirrors reaching into the sky. Just then, a group of students walked by. A girl recognized her and whispered to a friend, "That's Chief Grant." A boy replied, "My mom said Jefferson changed because of her." Alyssa heard it, but didn't turn around. She simply looked toward them, a warm feeling rising inside her. The children's pure laughter echoed through the square, bringing her more peace than 100 speeches ever could. That, she thought, is the real meaning of justice, not to have your name carved into stone, but to make sure the next generation can laugh without fear. The sun climbed higher light, spreading across the trees, gradually warming the entire city. Alyssa rose to her feet, walking slowly around the square, stopping behind the statue, where a small line was engraved for every voice once silenced. She read it silently, feeling each word echo within her. Justice, she thought, never needed to be loud because when people learned how to listen, truth would speak for itself. She left the square, her shoes leaving faint marks on the bright stone. A breeze passed by, making the white flower she had placed tremble. A few petals, breaking loose, drifting upward in the stream of light. On the courthouse steps, sunlight reflected off the glass, casting her silhouette into the morning glow. The city was quiet, but the warmth of that morning seemed to reach everywhere, in classrooms and conversations among locals and promises that silence would never rule again. And when the courthouse bell rang, its sound carried through the space, not as a call, not in sorrow, but as calm as Alyssa's voice when she walked away. Justice never needs to shout because its silence is enough for the world to listen. In the sunlit square where her bronze statue cast a long shadow over the stone, Alyssa still stood, eyes narrowing slightly under the dawn stretching over Jefferson. The city felt changed, more peaceful, yet within that peace lingered the echo of a past that had never fully left. Just as she turned to go, a voice called out behind her, young but certain, carrying a belief newly born. A young FBI trainee, uniform still stiff with newness, stepped forward and bowed respectfully. "If you made us believe." Alyssa paused, turning to look. His face was young, his eyes so clear they made her see a reflection of her early days, when she too believed that doing right would make the world follow. She said nothing at first, only smiled, hands clasped in front of her, then nodded gently. The sunlight caught the golden badge on her chest and reflected onto the trainee's face like passing on the belief she had carried all these years. He stood still, not daring to hold her gaze long, but emotion showed clearly. "We studied your case in public ethics class," he said, voice slightly shaken, "and when you said justice doesn't need to shout, it needs to be heard, I realized courage isn't always loud, it's sometimes just standing still and not turning away." Alyssa looked at him, her eyes filled with pride, though touched by sorrow. She understood his generation would walk a difficult path where light and dark never fully separate. "If you believe," she replied slowly, "then justice lives another day. Let your belief become the next part of this story." The trainee nodded and walked away, his steps more certain, while Alyssa remained. A breeze passed through the rows of flags carrying the soft rustle of small banners placed around the square by locals, each in inscribed with the name of someone who once spoke out during the transparency movement. Each name was a small piece of the long journey she had helped begin. She took a deep breath, letting the morning air fill her lungs, feeling as if Jefferson itself was breathing with her, releasing and renewing all at once. As she turned from the statue, the gentle smile stayed on her lips, not one of pride, but of peace. The sunlight angled through her hair, casting her shadow across the square. Behind her, the city remained quiet. No horns, no hurried footsteps, only the blend of birdsong and breeze. But within that silence, she could feel movement beneath the surface, like life pulsing through the streets, the bricks, the eyes of those passing by. Justice had awakened not with a cry, but through the shared heartbeat of people who believed that even slow light would arrive. Alyssa walked slowly along the stone path leading to the avenue. Buildings reflected bright sunlight off their windows, and trees cast long shadows across a street still damp from last night's rain. Everything around her felt newly washed, clean, and calm. She thought of the road behind, of the faces, wounds, voices once buried, now gently answered by this stillness. Above, the light spread wide, painting the city gold. Alyssa bowed her head slightly, hand touching the badge on her chest, a quiet reminder to herself. Justice doesn't need noise to exist, only people steady enough to listen. As she moved forward, her shadow merged with the light, and in that early morning, Jefferson grew so quiet one could almost hear something pure beginning, not the end of a story, but the first chapter of an era where justice no longer slept. In the quiet of a new morning, Jefferson carried a peace few ever thought possible. From the federal courthouse, sunlight poured over stone columns, reflecting onto the bronze statue of Alyssa Grant, the woman who made an entire system stop and look inward. Everything seemed to breathe again after years crushed by silence and fear. But to Alyssa, this peace was not an ending. It was a pause in a long journey, a journey taken by someone who believed justice was not given but earned through the courage to face the truth. From the morning she walked across Federal Street in the cold mist, insulted and shoved down by Dean Harlow before a crowd, to the moment her golden badge slipped from her collar and caught the sunlight, everything had changed forever. That fall did more than expose a corrupt officer. It showed the nation how power could warp without accountability. From an act of violence, a cruel remark, in a moment everyone else might have turned away, Alyssa chose to stand. She didn't shout. She didn't seek revenge. She acted as if justice itself were walking on her feet. That act, simple yet profound, became the beginning of a transformation no one, not even she, could have foreseen. When the video went viral, when her name appeared across headlines, when Jefferson became the center of public attention, Alyssa didn't see herself as a victim. She saw it as proof of an old disease, silence. It was that silence that made people like Harlow believe they had the right to do anything. She chose to confront it not with anger, but with truth. That truth, once exposed, shattered the walls that had long protected abuse of power within the system. From the Central Police Department's excuses to the federal hearing, from upper-level cover-ups to the moment Harlow bowed his head before the public, every mask was stripped away. And then, when justice was no longer just a theory, but a verdict delivered in daylight, Jefferson had no choice but to change. But what made Alyssa's story different wasn't the 12-year sentence Harlow received or the transparency law passed afterward. It was the way she redefined justice. She didn't stop when the courtroom closed or step back when the media moved on. Alyssa kept working quietly, kept reforming, kept teaching the next generation that justice doesn't begin with power, but with respect for humanity. She didn't become a symbol through pain, but through persistence. And from her, the nation learned that real justice doesn't live in chance, but in the small actions of ordinary people who choose not to look away. That change spread like a wave. The Federal Conduct Transparency Act was passed, requiring all official enforcement actions to be publicly recorded. Police academies included Alyssa's case in their lessons, not as a story of of failure, but of courage. In Jefferson, a memorial plaque was installed with the words, "She stood, she fought, she changed the system." Every day, people came by with flowers cards and handwritten notes of thanks. A former officer who once worked with Harlow left a small note that read, "Forgiveness is justice too," and when Alyssa picked it up, she smiled. In that smile, there was no pride of a victor, only the grace of someone who understood that forgiveness isn't weakness. It's the only way justice becomes whole. Her final meeting with Harlow in prison was a closing chapter filled with humanity in a story once marked only by darkness and pain. He said, "I understand now, but the price of this awakening is too high." And Alyssa replied, "Any price is cheaper than silence." That line became the symbol of the entire journey because she knew what corrodes a society is not violence itself, but the silent complicity that allows it. As she walked out of the prison that day, Jefferson seemed to cross a new threshold, where justice was no longer a distant dream, but something people could see, touch, and carry forward. A year later, when the city placed her statue outside the courthouse, Alyssa returned, placed a white flower at its base, and said quietly, "Justice never needs to shout, it only needs to be heard." The words spread beyond Jefferson, printed on billboards and textbooks etched into people's memories. They reminded the world that justice isn't power, it's a quiet voice, spoken only when someone is brave enough to listen. The story of Alyssa Grant did not end with a trial Aurora Statute T. It lives on in the eyes of a new generation, young FBI cadets bowing their heads before her and saying, "Chief, you made us believe." Because in the end, the greatest legacy she left behind was not victory over a system, but the belief that justice still exists and can still be rebuilt from the human heart. And that is the most important lesson Jefferson gave to the world. Justice is not the peak of power, but the awakening of conscience. When people stop before what's wrong, when they speak up against what's unjust, when they believe that even the smallest act can help keep the light from fading, then justice has awakened not in loud chants, but in the steady silence of those who still believe in what is right. Jefferson no longer carries a wound, but a reminder. Live in a way that when justice speaks, it is not to condemn, but to remind us that conscience has never died.